Wow, I would have never dreamed this day would happen, that I would be in front of a video to congratulate the class of 1962 on their 45th reunion. It just seems like yesterday I was a plebe, and a lot of you guys in that class, you didn't like me being on the training tables, and I even went to mass sometimes in the morning, and everybody thought I was getting away from come-arounds. You know, I guess, you know, when I was supposed to memorize those things in reef points and I didn't want to do it, or my shoes I felt were shiny enough that I was doing the right thing, but I probably deserved a lot of the things that took place that plebe year. Boy, I was homesick, and I couldn't wait to get plebe year over with. But the 16th company and my first Jerry Blesh have been instrumental in my life. The class of 62 taught me a lot about paying the price to have success and doing the things that you're supposed to do. And it took me a while to adjust, but being a graduate of the Naval Academy is probably one of the proudest moments in my life. It gave me the opportunity to have success on and off the field as an athlete and in business, and also to raise a wonderful family. And it's just like, you know, everyone that's seeing this video, that you've I'm sure, looked back at the Naval Academy and the success that you've had in the military. And in the military, career military people are my heroes. You know, as an athlete, sometimes I run the Naval Academy people that say, "Hey, Roger, hey, we're proud of your athletic career," but it's really, I'm proud of their career. I mean, my heroes are the people that defended our country. Yeah, this video is dedicated to the 29 members of the class who died in the line of duty, and we owe a great deal of credit to those heroes. Now it's time to watch this great journey.
This documentary recalls the history of the Naval Academy class of 1962. We celebrate 62's contribution to the defense of our nation, memorialize those who gave their lives for freedom, and recount our other personal and professional accomplishments in the historical context which we experienced. 1,054 young men reported to the United States Naval Academy on the 30th of June, 1958, including 159 enlisted men from the Naval Academy Prep School. They came from the 48 states, the territories of Alaska and Hawaii, and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. 6 came from South America and the Caribbean, 1 from Chile, 2 from Peru, 1 from Argentina, 1 from Panama, and 1 from Cuba. Most had the ambition to become either a Navy or Marine Corps officer, but first they would become midshipmen of the class of 1962. The radio and newspapers addressed a new threat from America's former ally, the Soviet Union. The new threat was called the Cold War. This Cold War would consume the careers of most of the new midshipmen for the next 30 years. 3 events during the 1950s would have a profound effect on the members of the class of 1962 during their military careers. First, the French government attempted to suppress a nationalist movement in their Vietnam colony led by the North Vietnamese communists, the Viet Minh. In 1954, the French were soundly defeated by the North Vietnamese army at Dien Bien Phu. After negotiations in Paris, French Indochina was split in two. The introduction of U.S. troops in the early 1960s involved many of the class of 1962. 17 classmates died in the line of duty in Southeast Asia. 4 classmates became prisoners of war in North Vietnam and spent many years in brutal captivity. The class of 1962 took the heaviest casualties of any Naval Academy class involved in the conflict. Second, the successful sea trials of the submarine USS Nautilus ushered in the era of the nuclear-powered ship. The results from a conference at Woods Hole, Massachusetts in the mid-1950s made clear the potential of placing long-range sea-based nuclear missiles on nuclear-powered submarines. The program, eventually called Polaris Poseidon and later Trident, placed enormous demands on the Naval Officer Corps. The Naval Academy class of 1962 responded to these demands. Third, the launch of the Sputnik satellite by the rocket branch of the Soviet Union military sent shockwaves through both the U.S. educational and military establishments. The emphasis on mathematics and science increased dramatically at the high school level. The class of 1962 responded to the demands imposed by the missile race with the Soviet Union, starting with a much tougher curriculum during their time at the academy. Three impressions greeted the new plebes upon arrival at the Naval Academy in the summer of 1958. The first was a magnificent chapel on the right as the young men entered the academy yard. The second was a fierce-looking statue of an Indian that stood before the courtyard of the largest dormitory in the world. The plebes would soon learn the name of the Indian, Tecumseh, and his history. The third impression was the huge six-wing dormitory that was named after President Polk's Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, who helped establish the Naval Academy. Soon uniforms were issued, long hair disappeared, and a group crowded into two wings of Bancroft Hall. One of the items issued was a small blue-covered book with the title Reef Points in gold lettering. Those plebes with a few minutes to peruse the book would learn that the crypt of John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, was located on the lower level of the magnificent chapel. The class of 1962 found the Naval Academy academic environment completely changed from the previous class's curricula. In 1958, the Academy was enjoying its 113th year of existence. Rear Admiral Charles L. Melson, class of 1927, greeted the new class in 1958. Captain William F. Brinkle, class of 1937, was the commandant. The Academy's graduates distinguished themselves in battle from the Civil War to this day. The Chief of Naval Operations in 1958 was one of the country's most gallant leaders, Admiral Arleigh Burke, a graduate of the class of 1923. Plebe summer was a blur of white uniforms, stenciled names, haircuts, and parades. Marching to and from each destination was guided by a group of new graduates from the class of 1958 and the second-class midshipman detail from the class of 1960. The barbershop shaved the plebes' heads, and the class was issued M1 rifles. Soon, each plebe made several trips to the rifle range and learned how to use it, along with a .45 caliber pistol. The first taste of big guns were the drills on the 40mm guns on the sea wall. The new plebe summer activities also included learning to march, sailing the academy yawls, YP drills, and an exciting ride in the old N3N biplane seaplanes. The YP drills gave the plebes their first taste of being on a Navy ship. When the upper classes returned, the new plebes quickly learned the rigor of plebe year. The football loss to Army caused the continuation of that rigor to the end of the first year. Plebe year ended in the spring of 1959 when Naim Benavente, our classmate from Peru, placed a class of 1962 cover on the top of the Herndon Monument. The class crest committee, led by Vic Reiling, finalized the design of the crest that adorned the new class pins received at the end of plebe year and formed the design of one of the sides of the class rings. At that time, just a dream of the future. Instead of a foreign cruise for the new third-class midshipmen, the class was privileged to participate in the official opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, serving in U.S. Navy ships. Their ships cruised along with President Eisenhower and Queen Elizabeth, who were aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia. Water was collected from each of the Great Lakes for the ritual dipping of the class rings 2 years hence. With the rigors of plebe year largely forgotten, the class of 1962 settled down to youngster year to the studies dictated by the new curriculum. The joy of the football victory over Army during the fall of 1959 was cause for celebration well into Christmas Eve. Second class year, 1961, broadened the class's view of the Navy and Marine Corps. During second class summer, while some in the class remained behind for plebe detail, the others experienced a smorgasbord of naval activities. The class first traveled together to Little Creek, Virginia for Marine amphibious orientation. Then, in rotating groups that included leave, the class traveled to Jacksonville, Florida to experience carrier landings, to Pensacola, Florida for flight orientation, and a short submarine ride at the naval base in Key West, Florida. Some got a tour of Cape Canaveral. One group saw a land launch of a Polaris missile. The very next day, the Navy performed the first submerged test launch from the USS George Washington, an historic moment that some of the class got to witness. Returning to class in the fall, each 1962 company switched battalions for second and first class years. The course load accelerated, but the sports activities and freedom of second class year helped take the edge off the academic rigor. The football team, now consisting of a number of 1962 classmates, produced another win over Army. The class was also privileged to watch the first Navy Air Force football game, which Navy won 35-3. Navy's All-American kicker and 1962 stalwart Greg Mather's field goal in the last seconds against the University of Washington Huskies was an exciting moment during the season. The joy of football victories over Army and Air Force during the fall of 1960 was highlighted by an invitation to all the Army and Navy players from Massachusetts, including Dick Fitzgerald and Ron Bell, to visit with President-elect John Kennedy in his Georgetown home. The euphoria of the season was somewhat blunted by the loss to Missouri at the Orange Bowl, New Year's 1961. However, the most exciting play of the game was executed by classmate Greg Mather. When playing defensive end, he picked off a pitch out on the Navy 2-yard line and went 98 yards for a touchdown. Rear Admiral John F. Davidson, class of 1929, became superintendent, and Captain Charles S. Minter, Jr., class of 1937, commandant in 1961. In November 1960, a relatively young, age 43, Navy veteran John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. The Brigade March in Washington, D.C. for the Inauguration Day Parade in January 1961 became a memorable experience when heavy snows fell before the inaugural parade. Some classmates became escorts at the inaugural ball at the D.C. Armory. One classmate escorted President and Mrs. Kennedy. In 1961, the swim team handed Yale its first dual meet loss in 16 years. Don Digit anchored both relays and won by a touch. The Navy basketball team in the winter of 1960 and 1961 was captained by 1962 classmate Al Hughes, quite an honor for a second-class midshipman. The Navy basketball team beat Georgia Tech, Virginia, Georgetown, and most importantly, Army that season. Second-class year ended with a traditional ring dance. Each classmate felt a tug in the stomach when he placed the class ring on his finger, and for some, an engagement ring on his girl's finger. Finally, the class had entered first-class year, with the end in sight. First-class year began with a traditional summer cruise. The class was deployed to various modern ships around the world. One hardy group of classmates gave up leave to spend time at Fort Benning, Georgia, earning Army parachutist qualifications and the coveted silver jump wings. Returning to class in the fall of 1961, the academy rigors seemed to increase, with many classmates taking extra courses. The football team, captained by John Hewitt, beat Army again for the third year in a row, a fitting end for the class of 1962 team members. Navy basketball had a banner year. An invitation to the National Invitational Tournament, NIT, capped a great basketball season for the team with Dave Tremaine as captain. They beat Penn State, Georgetown, and Maryland. Dave Tremaine, Al Hughes, Joe Brose, and Mike Miga started and were the backbone of the team. Other sports produced proud moments for the class and for the honored classmates. Andy Hesser won the Spike Webb Trophy, awarded to the outstanding boxer of the Brigade Boxing Championships. The Navy fencing team won a national title with Thane Hawkins, Buzz Hurst, and John McCarthy. Spring sports brought another national championship and a third Wingate Trophy for the lacrosse team, captained by Roger Kissel, and including classmates Fred Lewis, Don Kunkel, Frank Hughes, Vic Meyer, John Hewitt, Hugh Tabb, Minor Carter, and Tony Yanarella. Class volunteers for the burgeoning nuclear submarine force traveled to Washington to the old Navy buildings on the Mall for interviews by Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, class of 1922. Each volunteer's academic history was closely examined by the Admiral. Several amusing stories involving the 62 volunteers became a part of the Rickover and class legends. The 11th Company walked away with Color Company honors and was proud to be recognized at the final parade and Color Company ceremony. On 6 June 1962, 789 happy midshipmen from the class of 1962 listened to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George Anderson, class of 1927, give the graduation address, followed by the awards and diplomas. The graduation guest of honor was Fred Korth, Secretary of the Navy. The hats flew in the air after cheers for those left behind. The proud graduates stood while their girlfriends or mothers placed the new ensign or second lieutenant boards and pins on their uniforms. At the end of 4 rigorous years, most midshipmen became officers in the United States Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and even the Army. Several of the graduates were declared to be physically unqualified because of various injuries and other health problems. The exchange students from South America reported back to their respective countries for duty. A large contingent returned to Annapolis for plebe summer detail, and in the fall went about their warfare ways. Within the Navy, a large number opted for Navy Air, the Surface Force, and submarines, with many future submariners starting with nuclear power school. A smaller number found their place in the Supply Corps and the Civil Engineer Corps. While many of the class were involved in the various training schools including flight and nuclear power or had reported to their new ships, U-2 flights over Cuba during the fall of 1962 revealed activity of a suspicious nature. The Russians were preparing to locate missiles aimed at the United States on the communist island nation just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. A naval quarantine was declared by President Kennedy, and the U.S. Navy forces prevented the introduction of nuclear missiles into Cuba. Several classmates participated in the quarantine actions. The world and the American people held their collective breath until the Soviets blinked. Members of the class were deeply involved in the latest episode of the Cold War, which seemed pretty hot at times. During 1963, the world of the class of 1962, along with all Americans, suddenly changed. The first group of 1962 nuclear-trained officers was just finishing submarine school, while the second group was completing prototype training awaiting submarine school when the USS Thresher was lost during sea trials. This was an inauspicious start for their submarine careers. President Diem of South Vietnam was murdered on 2 November 1963, touching off uncertainty over the succession of that government and the response of the American advisors. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on 22 November 1963, shocking the nation and the world. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president and immediately faced a growing problem in Vietnam. This problem would consume the American public for the next 10 years and remain an issue well into the next century. 1964 brought home the reality of a military career when several class members were killed during training exercises. On April 14th, Don James was killed in a helicopter accident in the Bay of Naples, Italy. Dave Brodeur died in an aircraft accident in Massachusetts on May 22nd. Dick Tangier perished in another aircraft accident off Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on June 26th. After the alleged attacks on the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, President Johnson ordered the first bombing of North Vietnam in late August 1964. The class prepared to go to war. Class casualties continued in 1964 with the loss of John Fultz on October 27th from an aircraft accident at sea. In early November, President Johnson defeated Senator Barry Goldwater to earn 4 more years as president. Later in 1964, the class was further saddened when Dick Whitney was killed in an aircraft accident in the Nevada desert on November 30th. Bill Arbogast lost his life in a helicopter accident on the West Coast the day after Christmas while conducting a rescue operation during a civil emergency. As the United States began to form its Vietnam military strategy, much of the naval air activity concerned an air-to-ground war. The principal naval air activity involved the punishment of enemy units, bridges, and war support factories. The A-6 aircraft became the workhorse of the night bombing missions in Vietnam due to its sophisticated weapon systems and the large bomb load that it could carry. Dave Williams, Tom Woodka, and Tim Thomasy were all in several A-6 squadrons based at Whidbey Island, Washington, and made multiple deployments aboard various aircraft carriers to the Gulf of Tonkin. Subsequently, they all commanded A-6 squadrons. It became evident early in the conflict that the search and rescue functions needed a serious strategic and tactical overhaul. Eventually, the Navy, using SH-3 Alpha helicopters, took the responsibility for the North, operating off of carriers and destroyers with landing pads, while the Air Force, operating out of Thailand, covered the area west of Hanoi with HH-3 helicopters, the Jolly Green Giants. The bravery of the helicopter crews is legend. Many Navy SH-3 helicopters were involved in dramatic rescues over North Vietnam, bringing back downed airmen. Dave Wilson and Tim Thomasy were 2 classmates involved. They were both decorated for their rescue of downed pilots in the face of enemy fire. Surface warrior operations in Vietnam fell into 4 areas. First were the destroyers, destroyer escorts, and minesweepers operating off the coast who did shore bombardment, carrier support, and interdiction. Second were the swift boats, patrol boats river, PBRs, and the junk boat advisors. These folks mainly operated in the rivers. Third were the LSTs who delivered logistics and supplies mainly in the north around Nha Trang and Qua Viet. Last were the turbine-powered patrol gunboats that operated in the Mekong Delta rivers supporting the SEALs. People would call the Vietnam War the Lieutenant's War because 90% of the surface guys in country were O2s and O3s. Naval Surface Forces and long-range aircraft, P-2s, P-3s, and P-5s joined with the Coast Guard and the South Vietnamese naval ships to cut off the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese sea and river supply lines. Classmates answered the call for volunteers to support the Vietnamese Navy in both the riverine and the junk forces initially and later in the war. This interdiction activity would continue throughout the conflict. The year marked a challenge for the Supply Corps. Along with the growing United States forces in Vietnam, the Polaris Fleet laid out a Supply Corps officer billet for each of the 2 crews in each submarine. Meanwhile, to protect the United States Air Base at Da Nang, 2 battalions of Marines landed in Vietnam on 8 March to guard the Da Nang airfield and conduct combat operations. These and other Marines also fought in Operation Starlight, the largest battle in Vietnam in 1965. Probably the first class get-together in Vietnam occurred in 1965 when Ed Clark and Roger Ramsey, 2 junk force advisors, greeted Joe John as he came ashore in an amphibious landing. Joe recalls hitting the beach with the embarked Marines from the Amphibious Ready Group just south of Quy Nhon. It was shortly after his involvement in Operation Starlight on the Van Thuong Peninsula. Not knowing what to expect after prolonged and heavy action in Operation Starlight, his weapon was at the ready. However, shortly after touching down, instead of engaging Viet Cong, he was surprised to run into Ed and Roger. He was presented with some cold beer and a cigar. On a somber note, later in August, Ed Davis's A-1H was shot down and Ed was captured on August 24th. Ed was the first of 4 classmates to be held as prisoner of war, POW, in North Vietnam. A month later, on September 24th, Jeff Osborne was lost at sea in an aircraft accident with his F-80 off Vietnam. Jeff became the first classmate lost during the Vietnam conflict, and he eventually became the first class of 1962 name on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. War had reached the class of 1962, and the struggle was a long way from over. 2 more classmates lost their lives in 1965. Pete Koch was killed in an aircraft accident off Puerto Rico on October 16th, and Tom Murray was lost at sea after an aircraft accident over the South China Sea. Tom became the second classmate lost in Vietnam. Late in 1965, Bob Dawson, while flying combat sorties out of Chu Lai, saw Casey Kossaboom standing there while taxiing in Da Nang one time. Casey was there as part of the Da Nang ground contingent. At about the same time, Fred Polka, Jack Ceramic, and Dale Wyndham were also flying out of Chu Lai. 1966 opened with the United States resumption of the bombing of the North on January 30th. In January, P.J. Jones arrived in Da Nang. Mike Madalo was also in the squadron, and Jim Honeywell joined it later on. During a reconnaissance flight over a portion of Southeast Asia, Cy Roberts was lost on March 6th. Dick Law's F-80 aircraft was shot down over the north on April 3rd, and he was declared missing in action. Dick Hastings died on USS Repose, AH-16, on May 14th. And Cy, Dick Laws, and he became the 3rd, 4th, and 5th classmates lost in the conflict. Paul Galanti's A-4C was shot down over the north, and Paul was taken prisoner on May 14th. Paul became the 2nd classmate taken prisoner by North Vietnam. Mike Hennessy learned of Paul's fate when he ran into fellow Marine Jim Honeywell in July at Da Nang. Paul's wife had been Mike's wife's roommate in college. Later in the year, 4 more classmates were lost. Charlie Fryer's A-1H was shot down over the north on August 7th, and he was declared killed in action. Ground action continued. During Operation Colorado in early August 1967, John Sullivan was awarded a Purple Heart, one of 36 awarded to classmates. 6 weeks later, Chuck Knockle's A-1H was lost over the north on September 22nd. Meanwhile, back in South Vietnam, Jack Renfro died from injuries sustained in a vehicle accident. Sadly, the year closed out with the loss of Mike Newell. His F-8E was shot down over the north on December 14th. The war intensified in 1967. 5 classmates made the ultimate sacrifice, and 1 classmate was taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese. Lamar High School's O-1F was shot down over the north on February the 8th. A rescue attempt failed when the rescue HH-3E helicopter was hit by ground fire. Barry Delphin was lost over South Vietnam on March 20th in an Air Force F-100 Super Sabre. Jim Borsick was killed in an aircraft accident while flying a helicopter off the USS Essex in the Atlantic on March 29th. Meanwhile, the North Vietnam Army had built entrenched positions near Khe Sanh in the spring of 1967. From April 24th to May 11th, the Marines, including classmates Chad Dennis and Ray Madonna, fought what became known as the Hill Fights. Jim Honeywell, flying an F-8 Crusader, provided close air support for his classmates, while John Eric flew armed Huey gunship missions. The new M16 rifles issued to the Marines had serious malfunctioning problems that were corrected with a field upgrade. A year later, the Marines suffered heavy casualties but eventually cleaned out the entrenched positions. At the same time, but a few miles away, John Ripley and his rifle company were dealing with an ambush of a Marine engineer platoon near Ka Lu on Route 9 on the way to Khe Sanh. In March of 1967, John Ripley would enter a day-long battle near Con Tien DMZ with his rifle company. Wounded along with over 50 of his Marines, he was happy to see Joe Roberts, who flew in during the battle to recover the dead and wounded in his CH-46. Mike McGrath's A4C was shot down over the north on June 30th, and Mike was taken prisoner. He became the third POW classmate. On July 9th, during his third tour in USS Constellation off Vietnam, Charlie Lee's A4C was shot down over Hanoi. He was declared killed in action. His body was finally recovered in 1983, and he was laid to rest in the National Cemetery near Miramar, California. Back in the States, the class lost another when Lou Grant died in a helicopter accident at Test Pilot School, Pax River, Maryland, on July 6th. The North Vietnamese Army continued major operations through September and into the end of 1967, a rough year for the class and the American forces. The Viet Cong started the Tet Offensive against the Americans and the South Vietnamese Army on January 31st. The beginning of 1968 found Ken Duckworth assigned to the 21st Special Operations Squadron stationed at Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, dropping sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail or inserting teams in strategic spots. The sensors would detect movement down the trail, and the information was transmitted to Navy P-2s and P-3s who would relay the details for airstrikes. The 21st occasionally was used as backup for Jolly Green Rescue or to pick up on targets of opportunity. In February 1968, upon return from a mission, Ken was notified that a Navy P-2 had been shot down and his crew went to the scene. Ken's helo made 2 rescues of multiple crews that day, and one of them was a P-2 crew of Barney Walsh. Barney, on intelligence missions along the trail in Laos in February of 1968, had his aircraft hit by anti-aircraft fire, and he bailed out along with 6 other crew members. Barney was on the ground about 5 hours when the Jolly Greens picked him up, rescuing 7 of the 9 crew members. Later, Barney learned that the pilot of the rescue helicopter was his classmate, Ken Duckworth. Ken was decorated for the rescues. The spring of 1968 started on a down note when Dan Hertzfeld was killed in an aircraft accident on March 12th at Andrews Air Force Base, Washington, D.C. Classmate James R. Walker left the academy at the end of 1960. Anxious to fly, he entered the NAVCAD program, and by the time of 62's graduation, Walker was a lieutenant junior grade and flying helicopters. On April 14, 1968, Lieutenant Walker was engaged with the Viet Cong enemy. He was supporting U.S. naval forces under attack. For his actions that day, Lieutenant Walker was awarded the Navy Cross. He was cited for extraordinary heroism during operations against enemy forces in the Republic of Vietnam. As a fire team leader of a light helicopter fire team, he was called in to support United States Navy forces under attack on the Mekong River. He immediately commenced his attack against enemy emplacements on both sides of the river. Walker conducted an emergency medical evacuation from a damaged lighter in the face of a withering hail of bullets. After flying the casualty to medical attention, he rearmed and returned twice more to press his attack against the enemy. Lieutenant Walker's composure under fire, outstanding professionalism, and valorous dedication were in keeping with the highest traditions of United States Naval Service. John Lavue's F-4 was lost over Southeast Asia on September 19th. John and his crewmen were declared killed in action. The home front heated up severely when riots occurred at the Democratic National Convention that fall. On November 5th, Richard Nixon was elected president over Hubert Humphrey. Classmate Tom Carter lost his life during a mortar attack on November 10th. Brad Cuthbert's RF-4C was shot down over North Vietnam on November 23rd. Brad was believed to have parachuted out along with his backseater Mark Ruling. Brad was possibly captured, but there's no record of his survival. Mark Ruling was captured and released with other POWs later in 1972. The negotiations in Paris continued into 1969, which now included the Saigon government and the Viet Cong. During the negotiations, U.S. troop withdrawals started in mid-May. Ho Chi Minh died on September 3, 1969, but rather than easing the Vietnam situation, massive anti-war demonstrations rocked the United States later into October and November. 1970 was another tough year. The class lost another friend when Peter Nelson was killed in a helicopter accident in Pensacola, Florida on February 27th. Back in Vietnam, John Poe died in an Army hospital in Saigon on August 4th. In November, the class lost a true role model when Lieutenant Colonel William Leftwich, Jr., United States Naval Academy class of 1953, was killed in combat attempting to extract Marines of his recon battalion. Captain John Eric led a flight of Cobras in support of the recovery. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Joe Procopio, working for a U.S. Army general, was involved in the training of the Cambodian Army, gathering intelligence in Cambodia and overseeing U.S. Army Special Forces training these Cambodian units. Joe was later decorated by both the Vietnamese and the Cambodian governments. Just prior to the end of 1971, Dave Hoffman was shot down over North Vietnam and taken prisoner on December 31st, becoming the fourth classmate to be held at the Hanoi Hilton. U.S. forces were largely deployed with South Vietnamese units. Classmate John Ripley was advising a battalion of Vietnamese Marines in the area south of the so-called demilitarized zone. On Easter Sunday, 2 April 1972, John Ripley destroyed a vital bridge at Dong Ha, preventing 20,000 to 30,000 North Vietnamese troops from crossing onto Highway 1 for a major invasion of the South. He advanced to the bridge and personally placed explosives. Moving under the bridge hand over hand, he positioned over 500 pounds of explosive, all the while under enemy fire. With the help of another American advisor, he detonated the explosives and destroyed the bridge, thus thwarting an approaching attack by the mechanized unit of the North Vietnamese Army. For this action, John was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. In a bit of irony, the bridge John blew had been built in 1969 by the CB unit of another classmate, Bill Heine. The class celebrated its 10th reunion that fall of 1972, with many classmates still deeply involved in the conflict. On 6 October 1972, Snuffy Smith planned, briefed, and was part of a four-plane A-7E strike that finally put the critical Phan Hoa Bridge in the water, completing the work started by numerous Navy and Air Force pilots from as far back as 1965. Smokey Tolbert's A-7B was shot down and he was killed on November 6. Smokey, a former Blue Angel, was the first Naval Academy graduate to be selected for the team and the first classmate. He reported to the team in the October-November timeframe of 1967 to fly the 1968 show season. He was followed by J.D. Davis, who was the third Academy graduate to be selected. J.D. flew during the 1970-71 seasons. Smokey did not finish the 1968 season. Smokey had left the service and then returned to active duty. Smokey was the last classmate to be lost in the Vietnam War. The United States and North Vietnam agreed to a ceasefire on January 23, 1973, and the formal agreement was signed on January 27th. The last U.S. troops left Vietnam on March 29th, and the prisoners of war, including our classmates Ed Davis, Paul Galante, Mike McGrath, and Dave Hoffman, were released. On April 1st, the last of the prisoners were repatriated. The country and the class were overjoyed that our men had returned with honor. The years from 1974 to 1980 introduced more stress for the citizens of the United States. President Nixon resigned on 9 August 1974 as a result of the Watergate scandal. Vice President Ford was sworn in as president, the first non-elected official to rise to that office. During this tumultuous period, classmate Steve Todd served as naval aide to both Presidents Nixon and Ford. The last Americans left Saigon on April 29, 1975, and the Communists captured Saigon the next day. The collapse of South Vietnam in 1975 created hundreds of thousands of refugees to whom the media referred as boat people. Navy ships and aircraft with many classmates aboard searched for them in the South China Sea for several years. 25 years later, in 2000, Ed Crowley, one of the former airborne searchers married one of the boat people, a lady who had been born in Hanoi, raised in Saigon, a teacher and TV newscaster in Saigon who had set adrift at sea on a barge on April 30th, 1975, while 9 months pregnant, rescued by a U.S. Navy chartered vessel in which her baby was born. The class held a reunion to welcome and honor the POW classmates in 1976. Later that summer, women were admitted to the Naval Academy for the first time. In November 1976, Jimmy Carter, a Naval Academy graduate, class of 1947, was elected president. Classmate Dave Griggs, a pilot with a distinguished war record, was selected for astronaut training in January of 1978. Ron Hogan was killed in an aircraft accident off Point Mugu, California on May 29, 1980. Ron continued to pilot the aircraft while the remainder of his crew bailed out. His body was never recovered. Over the years leading up to 1981, 29 classmates made the ultimate sacrifice and died in the service of their country. 17 have their names enshrined on the Vietnam Memorial Wall, Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan defeated Carter in the November 1980 elections. The class celebrated its 20th reunion in the fall of 1982. Classmate Stephen Chadwick was selected to be Commandant of Midshipmen at the Academy from January 1985 to 1987. During that period, John Ripley had reported as Senior Marine on the Academy staff. The two classmates lived at opposite ends of Captain's Row. In April 1985, classmate astronaut Dave Griggs conducted the first unscheduled spacewalk to make repairs during a NASA space mission as part of Flight STS-51 Delta. The class presented a gift to the Naval Academy of 2 dioramas during a reunion in October of 1985. The first display, Ripley at the Bridge, depicted the action at Dong Ha Easter Sunday, April 2, 1972. The second diorama portrayed the capture of the German U-boat 505 by a boarding party under the command of Captain Dan Gallery, class of 1920. George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, won the election of 1988. Sadly, the class astronaut, Dave Griggs, a rear admiral in the Navy Reserve, was killed in a crash of his vintage airplane on June 29, 1989. Meanwhile, the so-called stability in the Middle East was shaken by the Iraqi forces massing on the border with Kuwait. In a lightning stroke on 2 August 1990, the Iraqis conquered Kuwait. A small contingent of U.S. troops rushed to Saudi Arabia to shore up the Saudi defenses on their border with Kuwait. The first battle-ready unit in position on the Saudi-Kuwaiti border was a Marine unit. Next, the United States began the buildup known as Desert Shield in 2 massive phases. First to 250,000 troops, then to 500,000. Desert Storm came in 1991. In September, classmate Bill Owens took command of the 6th Fleet and prepared to support Operation Desert Storm. Bill had previously commanded USS Sam Houston and USS City of Corpus Christi. Just prior to Desert Storm, Ted Schaefer, the class's only intelligence admiral, was sent across country by President Bush to explain the battle plan to all former presidents. As Desert Storm kicked off in 1991, classmate Bat LaPlante was commander of the Amphibious Task Force and Tom Droughty was ADC of the 1st Marine Division. Other classmates in senior positions put the detailed planning into practice. The Iraqi forces were ejected from Kuwait and thoroughly defeated in southern Iraq in a stunning victory. The Iraqis surrendered in mid-January 1991. The other dramatic story early in the decade was the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. The Cold War was over. For the class of 1962, this was a victorious effort taking almost 30 years. The careers of many in the class made a direct contribution to the finale of the other superpower. One could say that 3 generations of military officers, including fathers and sons and daughters, of the class of 1962 were instrumental in the defeat of the Soviet Union. All classmates below the rank of 07 were out on June 30, 1992, with one exception. In the fall of 1992, the class celebrated its 30th reunion with the retirement of many of the class. Later that fall, Bill Clinton defeated G.H.W. Bush. In March of 1994, President Clinton named classmate Bill Owens to the position of Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the second-ranking officer in the military. In early 1994, President Clinton nominated classmate Leighton Smith to 4 stars and to the position of Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, and Commander-in-Chief, Allied Forces Southern Europe, a NATO command. Admiral Smith assumed those positions in April 1994. Smith had previously commanded USS Kalamazoo and USS America. In June of 1995, classmate Hal Koenig, who had left the Academy and then pursued a medical career, was appointed as the Navy's Surgeon General. Later in August of 1995, the former Yugoslavian Republic was disintegrating into its ethnic components. The European allies asked for United States assistance, and the NATO military under Admiral Smith's command took charge of the action. Military action by the Allies brought an end to the atrocities in the former Yugoslavia. In December 1995, Admiral Smith took on the additional duties as commander of the Implementation Force, I-4, which was a NATO-led coalition to implement the Dayton Accords. In March 1997, Queen Elizabeth bestowed honorary knighthood for services as the latter. The class now had Sir Snuffy. Classmate Bill Miller, formerly the head of the Naval Research Laboratory and the Office of Naval Research, was named Academic Dean of the Naval Academy in 1997. The remains of John LaVue and his crewmate were located in Vietnam on May 19, 1999. John was buried with military honors in Arlington Cemetery later in July. From the November 1999 shipmate, classmate Bob Greenman wrote some poignant and personal words. The ceremony was particularly moving. The Fort Myer Chapel was packed with John's Naval Academy classmates and Marine squadron mates. Singing of the Navy hymn by such a great man's choir left no dry eyes. Bill Krulak, a classmate and former Marine, was the officiating Episcopal priest. There were full military honors with a Marine band, a platoon of Marines, a horse-drawn caisson, and a flyby of Marine Harrier jets in the missing man formation. The U.S. carrier fleet was and is able to project power to the far corners of the world. Amphibious task groups could be deployed to any troubled spot in the world. The powerful cruisers and destroyers contain the weapons and sensors to protect these task forces. The Soviet submarine fleet was tracked in the Atlantic and Pacific by the extensive SOSUS net, balanced by the surveillance of the P-3 long-range aircraft, the attack submarines, and the long-range sensors of the surface fleet. The surface fleet sensors included the LAMPS helicopter and the large hull and towed sonar. Many classmates contributed to the development of these sensors and the weapons designed to destroy the enemy should war come. During the Cold War, the United States submarine forces acted as an anti-submarine platform conducting intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, and provided the nation with the only survivable second strike capability. To quote Admiral James L. Holloway III, "Of special significance was the contribution of the ballistic missile submarine force of the U.S. Navy. These vessels became the invulnerable deterrent to nuclear war. While deployed, our SSBNs could not be destroyed by a hostile force before they had fired their ballistic missiles. This meant that the Russians could never initiate a successful preemptive strike to dearm the U.S. strategic forces. The SSBN missiles would always survive long enough to retaliate." Many classmates served in and commanded these mighty ships. Many of the Cold War operations involving submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and intelligence-gathering surface ships remains highly classified. The class members each know their own contributions. Books like Blind Man's Bluff describe many of the operations and name several members of the class of 1962. Mike Tiernan, Jack Maurer, and Ted Schaefer are specifically mentioned in the book. But the class will be older and grayer when their exploits and those of unnamed classmates are finally declassified. On June 21, 2001, the Patrol and Reconnaissance Force, U.S. Pacific Fleet, dedicated its tactical support facility at Marine Corps Base Kaneohe, Hawaii, in the name of classmate Rear Admiral Anthony R. Manis. Tony was cited as the driving force behind the concept, planning, and establishment of tactical support centers throughout the world. Sadly, Tony passed away from cancer at his Los Altos home May 7, 2003. The class celebrated its 40th reunion during the fall of 2002. The class didn't make a gift presentation at the 40th reunion. The class instead made a pledge to pay for the South End Zone scoreboard at the stadium. Under the leadership of the class-giving coordinator, Greg Chauncey, the class raised enough to pay for the scoreboard. John Ripley was named a distinguished graduate of the Naval Academy in 2002. In addition to being our first classmate into this distinguished company, Rip was the first Marine to receive that honor. July 2003 marked the commissioning of USS Mustin, honoring the naval service of the Mustin family. USS Mustin is the 39th ship of the Arleigh Burke class of guided missile destroyers. Mustin family members so honored include classmate Tom Mustin, his brother Hank, class of 1955, Tom's father Lloyd, class of 1932, and Tom's grandfather Henry, class of 1896. Tom earned a Bronze Star for river combat operations in Vietnam. The Commodore Uriah P. Levy Center and Jewish Chapel was dedicated in mid-September 2005. The Naval Academy was the last service academy to construct a worship space designed specifically for members of the Jewish faith. Classmate Howie Pinsky served as president of the Friends of the Jewish Chapel that raised over $11 million for the construction and maintenance of the center and chapel. The center is named for Uriah P. Levy, the first Jewish officer to be promoted to the Navy's then highest rank of Commodore in 1858. The center is used for ethics and leadership courses and contains the Academy Honor Court. Dick Law's crash site in Vietnam was located in early 2006. Dick's widow Karen, his daughter Cheryl, a 1986 Academy graduate and former A-4 pilot, and his grandson Carson visited the site in late March and early April. The remains at the site could not be positively identified, but the identification of Dick's F-8 was positive. Classmates sent Karen banners inscribed with their names and messages to be displayed at the location in North Vietnam. Karen placed the 357 ribbons on a pole near the crash site, an Asian tradition. Dick's son, Richard Allen Laws, a former U.S. Army doctor, did not make the trip, but inscribed this message on a ribbon. Dick Laws, a child's hero, a family hero, father, husband, brother, son, and grandfather. We love and miss you. With love and respect, your son, Richard Allen Laws. Classmates gathered again at the Newport, Rhode Island Naval Station in mid-July 2006 for the dedication of the new Ripley Building at the Naval Academy Prep School. In November 2006, the class received the sad news that Ed Davis, who had survived over 7 years' captivity in North Vietnam, had passed away. The United States Naval Academy Alumni Association announced the 2007 recipients of its Distinguished Graduate Award on January 19, 2007. Among the recipients is Admiral Leighton W. Smith, Jr., the second classmate to be so honored. Mike Newell's remains were repatriated in 2005, identified near the end of 2006, and announced in April 2007. Classmates gathered at Arlington National Cemetery on May 30, 2007, where Mike's remains were laid to rest. We have not given up hope that the remains of our other classmates will be discovered one day. The sad news aside, the 1962 classmates, like all military folks, still like to travel. The 1962 class flag, imprinted with a class crest, has accompanied the class members on their many trips around the world.
Anchors away, my boys, anchors away. Farewell to college joys, we sail at break of day. Through our last night ashore, drink to the foam, until we meet once more. Here's wishing you a happy voyage home. We fight our country's battles in
The class of 1962 contributed to society in many ways aside from their military accomplishments. These accomplishments are listed in Appendix B. One classmate deserves special recognition for the devotion to the class and academy. Corbin McNeil has served on the USNA Board of Trustees for many years. According to Snuffy Smith, another board member, Corbin's broad understanding of the financial affairs of the association was a large factor in the establishment of and the success of the United States Naval Academy Foundation. In December 2000, classmates John Ripley, Steve Chadwick, and Admiral Charles S. Minner, Jr. were asked by the superintendent to chair the Memorial Hall Committee that would restore dignity, sanctity, exclusiveness, and reverence of this center of the Academy. They oversaw the restoration and renovation as well as the addition of the new Operational Loss Memorial that recognizes all graduates who are lost in the line of duty. All of the 1962 classmates lost in the line of duty, as well as those of all Naval Academy classes, are now displayed there under the class crest on each individual panel. Reunion time is a time to renew old acquaintances, plan for the future, and to remember those who have gone on before, particularly those who have made the supreme sacrifice in the line of duty. William Levy Arbogast, James Paul Borsick, Philip David Brodeur, Thomas Lee Carter, Bradley Jean Cuthbert, Barry Ronald Delphin, Charles Wigger Fryer, John Morton Fultz III, Lewis Randolph Grant II, Richard Warren Hastings, Ronald Gilbert Haugen, Lucius Lamar Heiskell, Daniel Richard Hartsfeld, Donald Willard James, Charles Allen Knockle, James Peter Koch, John Allen LaVue, Richard Lee Laws, Charles Richard Lee, Thomas Edgar Murray, Peter John Nelson, Michael Thomas Newell, Jeffrey Holmes Osborne, John Raymond Poe, Jack Dennis Renfro, Cyrus Swan Roberts IV, Richard George Tanger, Clarence Orfield Tolbert, Richard Keith Whitney. Lord, you have done wonderful things for me in my life, the greatest of which is that you have allowed me to walk among men such as these. Arnie, 62. Long duty tours separated from wives and families were the norm for all in the Cold War. The wives made do through the periods of high inflation and long gasoline lines in the 70s. They held the fort at home against the anti-war sentiment. The POW wives' publicity helped keep the country focused on getting their spouses and other prisoners returned with honor. Classmates and their wives and families share in a job well done to end the Cold War.
Hi, this is Ray Madonna. The 62 DVD team hopes you enjoy this presentation as much as we enjoyed putting it together. There are some wonderful stories in this abbreviated history of our class. In any effort of this type, someone or something is invariably omitted because we didn't know about it or we forgot about it. For that, we're sincerely sorry. The good news is that our 50th reunion is on the horizon, and if you let us know what we left out, we'll look at incorporating some additional material into a revised version of the DVD. Go Navy! Beat Army!